team was incredibly hands-off, which is what we loved. I mean, they were there in the background, but they literally just sat and watched as we went through this amazing bonding experience together. And I got to feel like I got to put my skills to the test.
This is Kristi and Neil Douglas. And Kristi, start off by telling us about your first experience.
So my first delivery, I was young and
and in love.
Well, yeah. And we had a baby in a hospital. You go there, you get your epidural, and that was how it was done. So I went and got my epidural really early when I was only a 2. And so I remember thinking, oh, I wish I would have experienced labor a little bit more. Even though I had no intention of having a natural birth, I still felt a little robbed of what a real contraction felt like, or what it really felt like to be in labor. So my second delivery,
Well, I was a second year medical school.
Yeah.
When we had Hudson, our first one.
And second year med students know everything.
And I didn't know anything about labor or how babies happen. So it was a huge learning experience for me. But again, we weren't fully prepared.
We weren't prepared
at all for our first one.
Yeah, so we did an elective induction with our second. And after 2 rounds of Cervidil, things finally got going for us. I had taken no classes.
0.
Again, I
was a 4th year medical student, so now I really did know everything.
Right.
No.
Yeah, no classes.
We were unprepared yet again.
Yep. And elective induction. And then we broke my water when I was at about 5 centimeters, and then moved me to the tub, getting things quiet in my own zone. It was just my coach and I was really able to labor properly. I labored through transition, very calm, very quiet. And I was at a hospital where there was no water births, and you weren't allowed to deliver in the water. So after things seemed to be progressing, they pulled me out of the water to check where I was at. And lo and behold, I was complete. And it was time to push.
When the self-doubt signpost hit like a freight train.
And
I went pure panic.
Yeah, I went from being in my zone, in my labor zone with my coach, in a supported environment that I needed, to just, I was pulled out of it. And it was go time. They wanted me to have a natural delivery, and I was not prepared. I felt like at that point out of control, and that something was wrong.
And I was the same. I was not prepared for her to get into that emotional state where she, we were feeding off each other in those moments, and I was relying on her. It's hard because, I'm in a place where I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of control. I didn't have a whole lot of input. I know scientifically what's happening, but I have no idea what's really happening on your end.
You didn't know how to support me in that time. We both felt a little lost. And so I demanded an epidural.
Yeah, and at that moment, it was like, give her whatever she wants. I mean, I'm the loving husband. I want my wife to be okay. And if she wants an epidural, let's do that. So we were advocating the wrong way.
And so he gave me an epidural, and he left, and I'm still panicking. It's not working. Again, something's wrong. So they called him back, and he gave me another dose, and then he left. Yeah, the anesthesiologist gave me another dose, and he left. And my nurse turned me to one side, and then one side got numb, but I still felt everything on my other side. And again, something's wrong. It's panic. It's I don't know what I'm doing. So he comes back a 3rd time and gives me another dose. They flip me to my other side. And in the meantime, they're calling my obstetrician. She's pushing now. Get here. So he comes running in the room after I've had 3 doses of epidural. And I'm just kind of laying there and he's like, this is the woman who you've been rushing me to get here? Like, what's going on? And I felt the epidural creeping up. And then it hit my lungs, and then I can't breathe, and then I'm really starting to panic.
Your arms were numb.
I couldn't move my arms. The only way I knew how high it went is because I could move my head side to side and I could feel it at the top of my ears. The epidural, my face was numb, everything, and I couldn't move.
I mean, they were actively monitoring her vital signs. She was on high flow oxygen. They were doing everything in their power to make sure that this didn't turn into a crash C-section situation.
But I was kind of waving in and out of consciousness at that point. And I remember feeling and trying to say, I can't breathe. I'm not breathing. This was a direct result of being overdosed on an epidural.
So then we got to sit with the OB, and he sat there and just said, look, the baby looks great.
They put a fetal scalp monitor on her.
She has no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
So it's just me. And again, I had done a rotation in obstetrics, but it's always, they call you in at the last minute to catch a baby, and then you manage bleeding, and then you leave. You're not really managing labor. You're not really, it's just different. And so at this point, we just sat there. The OB and I were actually really good friends, and we talked, and he monitored her vitals. I was a little bit clueless as to really how emergent the situation was. I think he was protecting me from some of that, that being more of a traumatic experience. And at the same time, he was just really clued in on what was going on. We were very fortunate to have him. He was patient. And we sat there for how long? 2 hours?
3
hours until
3
the
hours.
epidural
At
wore
one
off.
point, they had me up when he came in, and they said, well, a lot of women feel like they can't push with an epidural, but you can still push. So they put me up in stirrups, and they were like, okay, push. And I'm like,
You couldn't.
am I pushing? And he's like, no. Nothing happened. My body went from full active. Her head was right there. Her head was there in my birth canal. And everything stopped. My body shut down for 3 hours. And so they put a fetal scalp monitor on her. So I remember her poor little head was bruised and bloody. And they had to take me out of stirrups. They had to roll me to my left side. And I got to sleep off the epidural for 3 hours with her sitting there. And my OB stayed scrubbed in at my feet for 3 hours. Yeah. Because he was so sure I was going to be a crash C-section. And everything just stopped for 3 hours. And then after 3 hours, it was like I woke up and I could breathe. And I'm like, oh, I feel this again. And my body started again. And then an hour later, I was able to push her out. I was told that my body needed an episiotomy to get a baby out. And so I had my second episiotomy. And
how long ago was this?
This was
6 years ago.
6.5 years ago. Yep. So then I got pregnant 5 years later, and we both knew
we were going to do it different this time.
Something needed to change. So we decided we wanted to do a natural birth, even though it terrified me because I'd kind of been through the start of a natural birth, and I wasn't prepared, and I panicked, and all these terrible things happened. And so I was very afraid to go the natural route, but I also knew that something had to change because the first 2 times with epidurals, I was very dissatisfied, and it was dangerous. So we made the choice for a birth center. We got a midwife, and it was a completely different experience, very, very intimate connection with the midwife. I felt very supported. I started getting some education on what natural childbirth was, but I knew I needed more. And so I had been researching classes.
She came to me and just said, I don't feel prepared. I'm so scared about doing this naturally, having no support. There's no option for an epidural. We're locked in with these, we love our team, we trust them, but I just don't know if I'm strong enough. I don't know if I'm strong enough to be able to do this. Yeah. And of course, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, you're plenty strong to do this. You basically did this with our last child until they screwed everything up. So you can absolutely do this. I had all the faith in the world in her. And so she was like...
But I didn't have the confidence in myself.
Yeah.
I didn't have the confidence in my body, and I didn't know this because, you think you've been through 2 deliveries. Oh, I know what to do. But I didn't I wasn't in tune with the natural birth process. And so I got us signed up for the class. And
I was not excited about it. I was like,
well, you were supportive because it's what I needed, but you didn't feel like,
yeah, but you were describing the class and you're like, it's about learning what childbirth is about. And I'm like, well, I kind of know because I've delivered babies a lot.
and about how
And it's
to have
about-
a supportive partner. And
And
that's
I'm
where I
like,
kind
I'm
of
a
lost.
pretty supportive person. I feel like I'm supportive and I love you and I was there for you last time, so it'll be fine. And I don't want to take a class.
And I mean, it was a commitment. It was a commitment for us. But the first couple weeks, it was talking about. I remember talking about inductions and how things can spiral out of control with inductions, and we're looking at each other like, oh my gosh, yes,
That happened.
all
to
this
us.
happened, and then here's what can happen with an epidural, and oh my gosh, yes, this happened with us. I mean, everything that was talking that was being taught about, even with fetal monitoring and all these different types of things. I mean, we had experienced all of it firsthand, and we're looking at each other like, oh my goodness, yeah, this is exactly our story. And then we got into the education part about what labor feels like and the different signposts. And we're looking at each other again like, oh my
Where was this
gosh,
information?
like, was she in the room with us?
Yeah.
Like, this is exactly how things happened. And so it was really affirming for me to learn those steps, because I'm like, okay, something isn't wrong with me. My body wasn't broken in these instances. And, it kind of affirmed to me, like, this was natural childbirth. This was a natural progression of things. I just, needed the education to know to push forward and to let the process happen.
One thing that I was really surprised by, Susan, was, you started pretty early on. I mean, you pulled out the Williams obstetrics book and just said, hey, this is what the obstetricians are taught. And I was like, oh yeah, that's the book that I have. And just pointed out that a lot of the methods that we use in modern obstetrics don't have a lot of evidence that are supporting them, and that the culture in medicine takes a long time to shift. And there's a lot of tradition built into obstetrics, and there's a lot of culture built into obstetrics, and there's not as much evidence as we'd like there to be. So I was really impressed that, you would pull out the studies and say, let's look at the Cochrane database and look at, a number of studies that have all been looking at the same issue. And you'll get some studies that fall on one side of the opinion column and some studies that, show evidence another way. But turns out if you trend these studies and look at all of them, it's a very powerful scientific statement to say we're pretty convinced that this is the way we need to be doing things. And things like delayed cord clamping, talking about the evidence with that was really really eye-opening. Talking about fetal heart rate monitoring, continuous fetal heart rate monitoring, that was supposed to be the greatest thing that was going to lower child mortality, and it's just stuck, and it's stuck in the hospitals. It's been in the system ever since, and it hasn't. It's actually done the opposite. And so there's a lot of things, where the evidence, and going through my training, we knew about these things, but it was like, how do we have the power to change this? We're so confined to how the system works. And really the answer is, the way to change it is to educate the patients on how to read their own bodies, and let them be advocates for what the truth is, and let them be advocates for what the evidence shows, and teach them the evidence. And in that way, we as the healthcare providers aren't sitting there saying, well, we're not doing things the way we normally are. We can say, well, we're respecting the wishes of the patient, and we're doing things the way they want to see it. So, and you talked about that. How are we going to change this culture? And that's something I really appreciated too. It's, well, let's get the evidence that's there out there, and let's empower these women to trust their bodies and to trust what they can do naturally, and to trust that if they are given the proper support, and if they're given the proper coaching, and if they're given, this timeline that they can rely on, it takes a lot of the doubt away. It takes a lot of the fear away. It's very empowering. And I think that, the outcomes, they're going to be much, much better. One of the hardest things for medical professionals to do is just sit back and do nothing. And it turns out that in this scenario, that's exactly what we need to do 95% of the time. It was just a whole different way to look at it. And
even though you had delivered babies and seen, from a physician's standpoint, you had very rarely seen a natural childbirth. It fell under the very controlled environment of coming in either with an induction, or they would come in, we would start, we would get the epidural, and then things followed that very, predictable course of, the cascade of interventions.
I mean, the C-section rates prove, and our, our child mortality rate proves that we're not doing things the best way we can. There are a lot of other people out there doing this a lot better than we are. And that's frustrating when you're practicing in a system where you feel like the system is not practicing best evidence, and it can be hard. So I felt, for me, when Kristi came to me and said, hey, let's go with a more natural birth experience, I thought, you know what? I really feel like God designed us to be able to have babies. I'm pretty sure this has happened for a while now, where this whole birthing thing has happened, and we as a human race have survived, and I think there's a pretty amazing design that's gone into that. And then just learning what I could do as a coach. I think that was the most amazing thing, was empowering the partner and the coach to be able to say, hey, you're in the zone and you're doing your thing, and my job is to be there as your support, and to be able to say, we just passed this signpost, we're doing great, and just to be that encouragement to say.
And how to support at each stage, because the support and the level of involvement and it changes. And I mean, as birth changes and as things progress, his level of involvement and things, it evolved and changed also. I was sleeping. It was about 3 a.m. and I had woken up to some regular contractions. I mean, it woke me out of a sleep, and I, having taken the class, knew like, okay, this could be it. I had been having some Braxton Hicks, but this felt a little bit more intense, and they were coming a little bit more regularly, probably about 5 to 7 minutes apart. So I laid in bed for a little bit because I wasn't able to go back to sleep, and kind of started timing them, and after a few contractions, rolled over to him and said, hey, I think this could be happening. Why don't you go back to sleep, and I'll just go out into the living room. We'll wait this out. So I'm laboring kind of out by myself on the couch, just, trying to relax. I just got kind of in like the side position, put a pillow between my legs, just kind of laid there, would time them casually, but they started becoming then 4 minutes apart. Okay, 4 to 6 minutes instead of 5 to 7, and lasting for 40 seconds as opposed to 30, and it just, things kind of started progressing. I pretty much skipped the first signpost. It really kind of started off serious.
The beginning.
It meant that I was probably going to have a faster labor, that I was going to be a speedster as opposed to somebody who's going to, go through all of the steps. I mean, it really did hit, and it was pretty much go time. I went back to him at about 45 minutes after being out, and I was like, okay, this is it.
Yeah, you come to me in the serious signpost stage, and I'm like, why did you I was mad. I was like, why did you let me sleep? I took all these classes and I'm supposed to be helping you, and here you like let me just sleep in. She's like, it's okay, I've got the car packed, I've got everything. And I'm like, you packed the car? What are you doing?
Well, I knew I knew I needed him to be rested, and there at that point there was nothing I needed from him. I was able to, although I was serious, I was able to manage it on my own. We called my midwife, and she said, let's wait for a little bit longer. And then he called her back about 30 minutes later, and she's like, okay, I can hear it in her tone. It's time to come in.
Yeah, you were starting to moan.
Yeah, it went from I can do this to going back to him like, I need you now. I can't do this anymore on my own. So we got to the birth center at 5:30, and I got to the birth center.
At 5,
yeah, we left at 5, got there at 5:30, and I walked into the birth center. They were filling the tub. I climbed right in and did not get out until the baby came. But for me, I really felt with my body was telling me I needed to stay put. I needed to stay in the water. They suggested walking around, and I knew at that time it just wasn't for me. I needed to be in the water. The cervical checks, can introduce bacteria and can introduce, just despair. Yeah, and that the numbers really don't mean anything. You can be at a 3 and you could be complete, 20 minutes later. I mean, the numbers really don't give you a lot of valuable, if any valuable information. And so when we got to the birth center, that was one thing they wanted to do, is they wanted to check me. And I knew for me, if I had heard a number that was, in my opinion, low for where my pain level was at, that it would have caused despair, that I would have had a lot of doubt in my ability to continue. And so I told them initially, no, I don't want any checks. I don't want any checks.
Previously when we'd be delivering, it was all about that number. And that number was something that that was our way of gauging where you're at in labor. But in her, in that moment, that number didn't hold really any real weight, because I could see what her body was doing, and I could hear her tones getting lower. I could see that any conversation, any noise in the room was really starting to bother her. The level of the seriousness was getting much, much more. She wanted things controlled. She wanted things just a certain way. So we would design our own, phrases that I could use just to help her mentally stay in that place where she could continue on with what she was doing.
But it helps to really think, how do you respond when you're in pain, or when you're needing some support? So
that was through the serious, signpost. We were using all the tools that we had. We were using everything at our disposal. And I remember, that there's a picture that our birth photographer got where Kristi's hand is just, she's trying to relax. You can almost see it. And, she's just in so much pain. It's there. And I remember right after that picture happened, she hit the self-doubt signpost, and she just looked up at me and she goes, Neil, I can't do this. I cannot do this. And I just looked at her and I said, babe, that is so amazing. You just reached the self-doubt signpost, and we are almost there. We get to meet our baby. And she just... It was amazing. And then
it
she
is a
just
very
got
real
into
signpost that you get to where you feel like
it was tangible.
You feel like you're
amazing.
maxed out, like you have reached the point of, this is all I can tolerate. And instead of it being the point of panic, this time it was the point of, no, this is normal, and you're progressing and things are happening the way they should happen.
Mm-hmm. For a while, I thought we weren't going to have it, because she was such a rock star the whole time. And I was like, dang it, we didn't even get a self-doubt signpost. But it happened, and it was cool.
Yeah, so it was about 20 to 30 minutes after the transition self-doubt signpost that I started getting the little involuntary, just the little pushes where I didn't want to fully push because I didn't want to tear. So I was really trying to just, gently let myself stretch and move her further down. When she came out, she was pink. She was crying. She was so alert.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I remember our first two, came out, but especially our first boy, a lot of massage, a lot of trying to get him to cry. And
it was amazing watching, because with the other two, she didn't, when the baby came out, she was kind of not with it. And, you could tell it was like she didn't get that major dump of endorphins and that, that surge of, just
it was, it was
elation.
so
But
emotional.
with this one,
when
she did. She was
came
just
out.
holding the baby and just crying tears of joy, and I'm crying, and we're just holding our new little one. And it took probably a full 2 minutes before we realized we didn't know what the sex of the baby was. We're just sitting there. And finally I realized, like, we don't know if it's a boy or a girl yet. Let's check, because she's wrapped in a towel. And so we, pull the towel away. And we're like, it's a girl. And, the excitement came back. And it just flooded in again. And it was just such a time of joy and celebration. And, to have her in a place where mentally she could experience that and physically she could experience that was different than the other two. The other two, the baby would come out and it was like, oh yeah, good, it's over and I want to take a nap now. She was alert and awake, and after all of that pushing, just, you just expect most marathon runners aren't like, jumping up and down and celebrating and, and then nursing a baby like you were. It was pretty incredible.